The cold wind in this city doesn't just bite, it chews. It's the kind of damp, deep-seated chill that finds the gaps in your clothing and settles right into your bone marrow, reminding you that you're made of fragile things. I was sitting on a damp piece of cardboard outside the Plaza Hotel, a piece of trash among trash, watching the elite of society step out of their armored SUVs. The cardboard was my only barrier against the freezing concrete, a thin layer of corrugated paper that was slowly turning into pulp beneath me. To the people stepping out of those vehicles, I was just a stain on the sidewalk, a ghost in a tattered field jacket that had seen better days and harder wars. They didn't see the scars from Bagram, or the way my eyes never stopped scanning the rooftops, looking for the glint of a lens or the silhouette of a threat that was no longer there. My mind was a map of old battlefields, a library of sounds that civilians never have to hear. The whistle of an incoming mortar, the specific click of a safety being disengaged in the dark, the heavy silence that precedes an ambush. But here, on the corner of 5th and Main, the only sounds were the hiss of tires on wet asphalt and the muffled laughter of people who had never known a day of hunger in their entire lives. I adjusted the collar of my jacket, the fabric rough against my neck. It was an old M65, faded to a color that was neither green nor brown, a relic of a life I had left behind in a cloud of dust and jet fuel. Most people looked through me, their eyes sliding past my face as if I were a glitch in their perfect reality. I was invisible, just another forgotten soldier waiting for a miracle or the end of the night, whichever came first. I watched a woman in a fur coat complain about the misting rain, her voice high and sharp like broken glass. She had no idea that a mile away, men were sleeping in dirt, and a world away, men were dying for the right to breathe the air she was wasting. Being invisible has its advantages, though. When people think you are nothing, they stop hiding who they are. I saw the way the businessmen checked their reflections in the darkened windows of their limousines, adjusting ties that cost more than my first truck. I saw the fear in their eyes when they looked at the shadows, a primal instinct they couldn't quite suppress despite their wealth. They were soft, protected by layers of glass and steel and bank accounts, but they were still prey in a world they didn't understand. I, on the other hand, was the predator who had run out of things to hunt. My stomach gave a dull, aching growl, a reminder that the half-eaten granola bar I found in a trash bin 6 hours ago was long gone. Hunger is an old friend, a constant companion that keeps you sharp when the world tries to lull you to sleep. In the teams, we learn to embrace the suck, to find comfort in the discomfort. But back then, there was a purpose to the pain. Now, the pain was just a byproduct of existing in a system that had no use for a man whose only trade was violence. I had spent years learning how to break things and keep people alive in the worst corners of the earth, and now I couldn't even negotiate a warm meal. The streetlights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the pavement. I leaned my head back against the cold stone of the hotel exterior, closing my eyes for just a second. Immediately, the smell of diesel and wood smoke filled my nose. I was back in the valley, the heat of the sun baking the rocks until they glowed. I could feel the weight of my plate carrier, the familiar pressure of the straps on my shoulders, the reassuring bulk of my rifle. I could hear the voice of my handler, the steady, rhythmic breathing of the dog at my side. He was a Malinois named Rex, a 60-pound ball of muscle and teeth that loved me more than he loved his own life. We were a team, a single unit moving through the tall grass, silent as smoke. A car horn snapped me back to the present. The vision evaporated, leaving me cold and hollow. Rex was gone, lost in a village that didn't exist on any map, and I was here, leaning against a building that cost $100 million. The transition from hero to zero is a fast one, a downward spiral that starts with a missed appointment at the vet and ends with a cardboard box on a rainy street corner. It's a slow erosion of identity, a stripping away of the titles and the rank until all that's left is the man. And sometimes the man isn't enough to carry the weight of what he's seen. I watched a young valet sprint toward a silver Porsche, his movements frantic and eager. He reminded me of a new recruit, all energy and no experience, unaware of how quickly the world can turn on you. I wondered if he would ever have to stand in a line for a bowl of soup, or if he would spend his whole life in this bubble of luxury. I didn't envy him, but I felt a strange sort of pity. He was living in a dream, and eventually, everyone has to wake up. The rain started to come down harder, turning the mist into a steady drizzle that soaked through the shoulders of my jacket. I shifted my weight, trying to find a dry spot on the cardboard, but it was a losing battle. The water pooled in the creases of the sidewalk, reflecting the neon signs of the shops across the street. Red, blue, gold, the colors of a city that never stops consuming. I was just something it hadn't finished digesting yet. I reached into my pocket and felt the small, jagged piece of metal I carried with me everywhere. It was a fragment of a grenade casing, a piece of the blast that had ended my career and started my descent. It was a reminder that I was still alive, even if it didn't feel like it most days. I rubbed my thumb over the rough surface, the sharp edges pressing into my skin. Pain is a grounding force. It keeps you in the moment when your mind wants to drift back to the places it shouldn't go. Suddenly, the atmosphere changed. It wasn't a sound, but a vibration, a frequency that my body recognized before my brain did. A convoy of 3 blacked-out SUVs turned the corner, moving with a precision that didn't belong to civilian drivers. They weren't just driving, they were patrolling. They maintained a perfect interval, their headlights cutting through the rain like searchlights. My heart rate began to climb, a steady drumbeat in my ears. This wasn't the usual parade of wealthy guests. This was something else. The lead vehicle pulled to a stop exactly 3 feet from the hotel entrance. The doors didn't open immediately. They waited, checking the perimeter, performing a silent count that only someone who had done it would notice. I sat up a little straighter, my muscles tensing under the damp fabric of my coat. The air around the Plaza Hotel seemed to solidify, the casual chatter of the crowd dying down as the presence of the vehicles demanded attention. Something was coming. Something that belonged to the world I had lost. I watched the middle Suburban, the one with the darkened glass that revealed nothing. I knew that vehicle was armored to a level 7, capable of taking a direct hit from an RPG. I knew the tires were run flats, and the engine was tuned for high-speed evasion. But more importantly, I knew the kind of man who sat in the back seat of a rig like that. As the door of the Suburban finally swung open, a heavy silence settled over the street. The rain seemed to hang suspended in the air, caught in the glow of the streetlights. I felt a familiar surge of adrenaline, the old fight-or-flight response kicking into gear. My hands stopped shaking from the cold and became perfectly still. I wasn't just a homeless vet anymore. I was a handler, a scout, a soldier on high alert. And as the first figure stepped out into the rain, I realized that my long night of being invisible was about to come to a violent, crashing end. A man in a crisp suit stepped out of the lead vehicle, but he wasn't the one who caught my eye. He was a professional, likely private security or a lower-tier federal agent, moving with the stiff, rehearsed urgency of someone who took his job seriously but hadn't actually smelled cordite in years. He scanned the crowd with a practiced sweep, looking for a hand in a pocket or a sudden movement. but his eyes skipped right over me. To him, I was just part of the architecture, a pile of rags and misery that posed no threat to his high-value cargo. He didn't see the way my weight was shifted onto the balls of my feet, or the way my breathing had leveled out into the combat rhythmic cycle I'd practiced 10,000 times. But then, the rear door of the second SUV opened, and the air didn't just shift, it shattered. It was the creature at his side that stole the oxygen from the sidewalk. A Belgian Malinois jumped out, landing on the wet asphalt with the silent, predatory grace of a mountain lion. This wasn't a pet, and it wasn't a standard police dog. This was a weapon of war draped in a tactical harness made of reinforced nylon and carbon fiber, complete with a handle on the back for fast roping out of a Black Hawk helicopter. He had ears like radar dishes that twitched at frequencies the human ear couldn't even process, and eyes that held the cold, analytical wisdom of 1,000 midnight patrols in the Valley of Shadows. The dog stood perfectly still, his muscles rippling beneath a coat that was the color of burnt mahogany. He didn't bark, he didn't pant, he just waited for the command, his tail as stiff as a piece of rebar. This was a multi-purpose canine, the kind of animal that costs more than a luxury sedan to train and is worth 10 times that in blood and loyalty. As the man and the dog approached the hotel entrance, the crowd parted like the Red Sea, people instinctively stepping back from the raw kinetic energy radiating off the animal. Even the wealthy elite, with all their jewelry and arrogance, felt the primal urge to get out of the way of something that was born to hunt. I felt a phantom weight on my own hip where my sidearm used to sit, a heavy ache that reached deep into my nervous system. My heart started hammering against my ribs, a frantic rhythm that felt like it was trying to beat its way out of my chest. I knew that look. I knew the way that dog's nose was working, filtering through the scents of expensive perfume, car exhaust, and rainy pavement to find the one thing that didn't belong. He was looking for something or someone.
The handler was a younger man, maybe in his late 20s, wearing a tactical polo and khakis that were a bit too clean for my liking. He held the lead with a firm grip, his knuckles white, clearly feeling the pressure of escorting such a high-tier asset through a civilian environment. He looked stressed, his eyes darted toward the hotel doors as if they were a finish line he couldn't reach fast enough. He didn't have the handler's flow, that silent telepathic connection that exists between a man and a dog who have bled together. To him, the dog was a tool he had been assigned. To the dog, the man was just a weight at the end of the leash. I watched them move closer, every step they took feeling like a hammer blow against my skull. The rain was coming down harder now, blurring the edges of the world, but the dog remained in sharp, terrifying focus. He was scanning the perimeter, his head moving in short, controlled bursts. I saw the moment his ears locked forward, focusing on a group of teenagers laughing near the fountain. He dismissed them in a heartbeat. Then his gaze began to sweep toward the shadows of the hotel wall, toward me. I tried to shrink further into my jacket, to become the ghost everyone else thought I was. I looked down at my boots, the leather cracked and salt-stained, hoping the dog would just see another piece of urban debris. But you can't lie to a Malinois. They don't see your clothes or your bank account. They see your soul, and they smell the adrenaline leaking out of your pores. I could feel the heat rising in my face despite the freezing wind. My mind was screaming at me to move, to run, to disappear into the alleyway. But my body was frozen by a decade of training that told me to hold my ground. The guards near the hotel entrance saw the dog's intensity and misinterpreted it. They thought the animal was getting agitated because of the vagrants sitting too close to the path. One of them, a guy with a buzz cut and a sense of self-importance that far outweighed his paycheck, stepped forward. He reached for his belt, his hand hovering near his baton. He was looking at me with a mixture of disgust and irritation, ready to play the hero for the people in the SUVs.
"Hey you, get up and move," he barked, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "You're blocking the entrance. Get your trash and clear out before I make you." I didn't answer, and I couldn't. All my focus was on the dog. The Malinois had stopped 10 feet away. He wasn't looking at the guard. He wasn't looking at the hotel doors. He was staring directly at me, his body vibrating with a tension that was almost audible. The handler pulled on the lead, trying to force the dog to keep moving, but the animal was an anchor. He wouldn't budge. The silence that followed was suffocating. The rain seemed to stop mid-air, and the sound of the city faded into a low, distant hum. Everyone was watching. The socialites in their furs, the drivers in their suits, the guards with their hands on their weapons. They were all waiting to see what would happen when a lethal predator finally reached the end of its patience with a man who had nothing left to lose. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead, mixing with the rain. I knew what was coming. I knew that dog wasn't agitated. He was recognizing a frequency, a warrior's frequency. And in that moment, I realized that the secret I had been keeping, the fact that I wasn't just a homeless man, but a broken piece of the nation's spear, was about to be ripped wide open for everyone to see. The guards moved toward me, their heavy boots splashing through the shallow puddles with a rhythmic, aggressive thud. They were ready to clear the path for the important guest, their faces twisted into that mask of professional indifference that usually precedes a forceful removal. I started to slowly gather my things, my fingers numbed by the cold as I gripped the damp edges of my cardboard sanctuary. I was used to the routine of being shoved into the shadows, of being treated like an obstacle rather than a human being. But this time, the air felt different. It was thick with a tension that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. A familiar static that usually meant an ambush was seconds away. But then, the dog stopped dead in his tracks. He didn't bark and he didn't growl, which was the first thing that made the lead guard hesitate. A barking dog is a warning, but a silent, staring Malinois is a promise of incoming violence. He went rigid as a statue, his muscular frame rocking into a point so sharp it could have cut glass. His gaze was locked directly onto mine, bypassing the grime on my face and the holes in my jacket. The handler, a man who clearly didn't understand the depth of the animal he was holding, pulled back on the lead with a sharp jerk. He gave a command in Dutch, his voice cracking with a mixture of embarrassment and rising panic. For the first time in that dog's career, he disobeyed. He didn't even flinch at the physical correction. He remained anchored to the pavement, his eyes burning into mine with an intensity that seemed to peel back the layers of my failed civilian life. The silence that fell over the sidewalk was heavy, an oppressive weight that silenced the city noise and the idle chatter of the socialites. Everyone was watching a homeless man stare down a lethal predator, and for a heartbeat, it felt like the entire world was holding its breath. The lead guard, sensing the crowd's eyes, decided he needed to escalate. He stepped between me and the dog, his hand moving toward his pepper spray, his chest puffed out in a display of dominance that the Malinois didn't even acknowledge. To the dog, the guard didn't exist. He was just a ghost in the way of a superior signal. I could see the dog's nostrils flaring, filtering the scent of my old field jacket, the faint, lingering trace of gun oil and high-grade explosives that never truly leaves a man's gear, no matter how many times it's rained on. I looked at the handler, whose face was flushing a deep, frustrated red. He was out of his league, a man holding the leash of a god and trying to treat it like a golden retriever. He didn't see the specific tilt of the dog's head or the way the animal's tail gave one singular, minute twitch. He didn't recognize the transition from patrol mode to recognition mode. My heart was drumming a frantic cadence against my ribs, a physical reminder that I was still a soldier, even if the world had retired my rank. The guard barked another order at me, his spit hitting the shoulder of my jacket, but I didn't hear the words. I was back in the mountains, hearing the silent communication of a unit that moved as one. I saw the dog's ears swivel back for a fraction of a second, acknowledging the handler's presence, only to snap forward again, locking onto my eyes with an unwavering focus. It was a stare down that spanned a decade of service and 1,000 miles of trauma. The socialites began to whisper, their voices rising in a frantic, nervous twittering. They saw a threat, a malfunction in the security perimeter. They saw a dangerous animal losing its training in the presence of a vagrant. But I saw something else. I saw a brother in arms looking for his commander. I saw a creature that had been trained to find the elite, recognizing the signature of a man who had once led teams into the mouth of hell. The handler tried one last time to force the dog into a heel, his voice dropping into a growl of his own. He was desperate to maintain the illusion of control in front of the high-ranking guests watching from the SUV, but the dog's paws seemed to be fused to the asphalt. He lowered his center of gravity just an inch, a subtle shift that told me he was preparing for a gesture that would change everything. The guard took another step toward me, his hand reaching for my collar, but he stopped when he felt the sudden, icy shift in the atmosphere. I realized then that the dog wasn't waiting for the handler's permission. He was waiting for mine. He was waiting for a sign that I was the man he thought I was. The grime, the cardboard, and the shame were all just camo to the rest of the world, but to this animal, they were transparent. He was looking at the soul of a chief petty officer, and he was demanding that I look back.
As the rain intensified, blurring the lines between the sidewalk and the street, the standoff reached its breaking point. The handler prepared to use a physical strike to get the dog to move, his hand raising in a sharp arc. My eyes met the dog's one last time, and in that silent exchange, I felt the ghost of my own canine, Rex, standing right beside me. I realized that the secret was out. I couldn't be a ghost anymore. Not today. Not in front of him. The dog's muscles coiled, his breathing slowed to a rhythmic hum, and the entire sidewalk braced for the explosion they thought was coming, completely unaware that they were about to witness a miracle of military discipline that wasn't meant for their eyes. What happened next made the socialites gasp, and the security guards reach for their radios in a blind, panicked reflex. They expected a lunging strike, a flash of white teeth, and the sound of tearing fabric, because that is all they understood of power. But the Belgian Malinois didn't charge. He slowly broke his heel position, stepping away from the handler who was still desperately tugging at the carbon fiber lead with a frantic, useless energy. The dog walked toward me with a measured, deliberate pace that silenced the entire block. He moved with a heavy, rhythmic grace, his paws clicking against the wet pavement like the ticking of a countdown clock that had finally reached 0. When he reached the edge of my cardboard sanctuary, the world seemed to shrink until there was nothing left but the two of us and the smell of the rain. He didn't sniff for food, and he didn't check my pockets for the scraps of a discarded life. He stopped exactly 24 inches from my knees, his chest broad and powerful, his ears swiveling to block out the shouting of the handler and the confused murmurs of the crowd. He looked into my eyes, and for the first time in 3 years, I felt seen, truly seen. Not as a problem to be solved or a ghost to be avoided, but as a man who had stood in the breach when the world was on fire. Then the dog performed a movement that drained the color from the lead guard's face. He didn't just sit. He lowered his head until his snout almost touched the grime-covered concrete. He tucked his front paws inward with a sharp, disciplined snap and sank his rear haunches into a deep, formal bow. It was a posture of total, unwavering submission, a specific signal used only by Tier 1 multi-purpose canines to show respect to a superior alpha or a legendary handler. It was a salute that required no hands and no words, yet it spoke louder than any medal pinned to a dress uniform.
My breath hitched in my throat, a sharp, painful intake of air that felt like a knife in my lungs. I realized this dog didn't just see a man on a street corner. He recognized the soul of a warrior. He recognized the specific, invisible weight I carried on my shoulders, the phantom weight of a plate carrier, and the heavy responsibility of lives held in the palm of a hand. He was acknowledging a rank that the civilian world had stripped away from me the moment I turned in my ID card. He was telling me that in the world of the elite, I was still a chief, and he was still my brother. The handler stood frozen, his arms still raised in a useless gesture of correction. He looked at the dog, then at me, then back at the dog, his jaw dropping as he realized he was witnessing a behavior that wasn't in any training manual he had ever studied. This was off-book. This was the deep tissue memory of a breed that had been bred for loyalty and honed for war. The dog stayed in that bow, his body as still as a mountain, ignoring the rain that was now saturating his mahogany fur. He was waiting for me to acknowledge the salute, his tail giving one singular heavy thump against the wet pavement. A woman in a silk dress stepped back, her hand covering her mouth in shock. She had spent the last 10 minutes pretending I was a piece of trash, but now she was watching a $50,000 asset treat me like royalty. The security guards looked at each other, their aggression evaporating into a cloud of pure, unadulterated confusion. They didn't know how to process a reality where the predator was honoring the prey. They didn't understand that the hierarchy of the street had just been overwritten by the hierarchy of the battlefield. I felt the tears stinging the corners of my eyes, a heat that defied the freezing wind. I wanted to reach out and touch the dog's head, to feel the warmth of his life against my cold, shaking hands. But I held back. I knew the rules. I knew the discipline. I looked at the dog and saw the reflection of every canine I had ever served with, every animal that found the IED before it found us, every partner that kept watch while we caught an hour of restless sleep in the dirt. This dog was an emissary from a life I thought I had lost forever.
The silence grew even deeper. A heavy, holy quiet that seemed to push back the city noise for 100 yards in every direction. The socialites were no longer looking at their watches or their phones. They were staring at the bow. They were witnessing a moment of pure, untainted honor in a world that usually only understood transactions. The dog stayed down, his nose nearly touching my boots, refusing to rise until he was dismissed by the only person on that sidewalk who outranked everyone else. I realized then that I couldn't keep my head down anymore. I couldn't continue to be the ghost that everyone wanted me to be. This dog had called me out. He had challenged me to remember who I was, to stand up and reclaim the dignity that had been eroded by months of hunger and neglect. He was holding the salute, a bridge between my past and my present, and I knew that if I didn't respond, I would be betraying everything we had both been trained to believe in. As the rain turned into a downpour, soaking through my jacket and the dog's harness, the tension reached a crescendo. The handler finally found his voice, but it was no longer a shout. It was a whisper of pure awe. He looked at me, his eyes wide and searching, and I knew he was starting to see the man behind the beard and the grime. He was starting to see the operator. I took a deep breath, the cold air filling my chest, and I felt the old iron return to my spine. The dog's ears twitched, sensing the change in my posture, and we both knew that the next few seconds were going to change the course of the night and the rest of my life. The handler was shouting now, a frantic, high-pitched barking of his own that betrayed his total loss of composure. He was confused, embarrassed, and likely terrified that his high-stakes asset was malfunctioning in front of a sidewalk full of the city's most powerful people. He grabbed the heavy nylon handle on the back of the dog's vest, his boots slipping on the wet pavement as he tried to physically yank the 60-pound animal away from me.
He was treating the dog like a disobedient pet, failing to realize that he was trying to move an anchor forged in the fires of specialized combat. But I couldn't sit there and let the animal take the heat. I couldn't let this warrior be punished for the sin of recognizing a brother. I stood up. It wasn't the slow, defeated rise of a homeless man begging for a reprieve. It was a mechanical, deliberate movement that felt like a machine being powered back online after years of rust. My spine cracked, a series of sharp pops that echoed against the cold stone of the hotel wall, and I felt the old iron return to my posture. I didn't look at the handler, and I didn't look at the guards who were now frozen with their mouths slightly open. I looked only at the dog. I found the center of my voice, the deep, resonant chest tone that had commanded platoons through the roar of rotor wash and the chaos of heavy contact. I spoke one single word. It wasn't a shout. It was a low-frequency, guttural command in a specific dialect of Dutch that is used only by the Tier 1 handlers of the elite SEAL teams. It was a word that carried the weight of authority, a sound that bypassed the dog's ears and went straight to his nervous system. The effect was instantaneous. The dog's entire body shivered once, a ripple of muscle moving from his nose to his tail. He didn't just stop bowing, he snapped into a perfect, vibrating sit-stay. His tail hit the wet pavement with one singular heavy thump, a punctuation mark on a sentence of absolute loyalty. The handler froze as if he had been struck by a bolt of lightning. His hand remained wrapped around the dog's harness, but his arm went limp, his fingers loosening their grip as the realization began to sink in. He looked at the dog, who was now ignoring every command he had ever been taught in favor of the one I had just given. Then he looked at me, his eyes wide and searching, trying to reconcile the man in the grease-stained field jacket with the voice that had just exerted total control over a lethal weapon. He saw the way my shoulders had squared, the way my chin had lifted, and the way my eyes had gone cold and flat, the 1,000-yard stare that only comes from looking into the abyss and refusing to blink. The silence that followed was so thick you could have cut it with a combat knife. The rain continued to fall, but no one moved. The socialites had stopped their whispering, their expensive umbrellas tilting as they craned their necks to see the man who had just silenced a beast with a whisper. The security guards, who seconds ago were ready to tackle me into the gutter, had retreated a step, their hands dropping away from their belts. They didn't know who I was, but they knew what I was. They recognized the predator's shadow, the invisible aura of a man who had spent his life in the dark, so they could live in the light. I didn't break eye contact with the Malinois. I could see the steam rising off his back, the heat of his body meeting the cold night air. He was waiting for the next signal. His ears swiveled toward me, filtering out the sound of the idling SUVs and the distant sirens. He didn't care about the gala, the Admiral, or the men in suits. He only cared about the mission. And in his mind, the mission was standing right in front of him. I felt a surge of pride that I hadn't felt in years, a raw, stinging emotion that threatened to break through the armor I had built around my heart. The handler finally found his voice, but it was no longer the voice of a man in charge. "How did you do that?" he stammered, his breath hitching in his throat. "That's a level 3 tactical command. No one outside of the program is supposed to know that word." He looked at the dog, then back at me, his face pale in the glow of the streetlights. He saw the scars on my hands, the white lines of old shrapnel wounds that mapped out a history of sacrifice. He saw the way I held myself, the operator's stance that never truly leaves a man even when he's sleeping on a sidewalk. I didn't answer him. I didn't owe him an explanation, and I didn't have the energy to explain the years of blood and dirt that had earned me the right to speak that word. I just stood there, the rain soaking through my layers, feeling the heavy presence of the dog's devotion. I was no longer invisible. I was no longer a ghost. For the first time since I had been processed out of the Navy with a handshake and a good luck, I felt like a human being again. I felt like a soldier. The middle SUV, the one with the armored glass and the silent passengers, began to roll forward an inch, as if the person inside couldn't wait any longer to see the source of the disturbance. The tension on the sidewalk reached a breaking point, the air vibrating with the unspoken questions of a dozen witnesses. They were waiting for me to disappear back into the shadows, but the dog wouldn't let me. He stayed in his sit, his eyes locked onto mine, a silent guardian who had decided that the night for hiding was over.
As the door of the armored Suburban began to swing open for the second time, I realized that the life I had been living, the life of a forgotten vet waiting for the end, was officially dead. The dog had blown my cover, and he had done it with a bow and a thump of his tail. I took a deep breath, the cold, damp air filling my lungs with a sense of purpose I thought I had buried in the mountains of Afghanistan. The stage was set, the audience was waiting, and as the high-ranking figure stepped out of the vehicle to confront the man who had hijacked his canine, I knew that the real battle was only just beginning. The middle SUV door didn't just open, it swung wide with a heavy, armored thud that signaled the arrival of someone who didn't wait for permission. A man stepped out, bypassing the security detail that tried to scramble into position. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo like the rest of the gala guests. He was in a dark charcoal suit that fit him with military precision, his hair a stark, disciplined silver that caught the glare of the hotel's neon sign. This was Admiral Vance. I hadn't seen that face in a decade, not since a sweltering tarmac in Germany where he'd pinned a bronze star to my chest and told me the nation owed me a debt it could never repay. Apparently, the interest on that debt had expired the moment I hit the civilian sector. The Admiral stopped 3 feet from the canine, his eyes darting from the dog's rigid sit-stay to the handler's pale face, and finally, to me. He looked at the grime under my fingernails, the salt-stained fabric of my field jacket, and the heavy, matted beard that hid the jawline of the man he used to know. For a long, agonizing minute, he just stared. He saw a vagrant. He saw a public nuisance. He saw a malfunction in his evening plans. But then, he looked at my eyes. The 1,000-yard stare isn't something you can fake. It's a flat, hollow depth that comes from seeing the world torn apart and put back together with duct tape and adrenaline. The Admiral's expression shifted from irritation to a sudden, jarring recognition. He looked at the way I stood, my weight distributed for a quick draw, my thumb hooked unconsciously into the strap of my tattered backpack as if it were a rifle sling. He looked at the canine, who was still vibrating with a frequency of pure devotion, and his eyes went wide with a mixture of horror and absolute shame. "Chief," he whispered. The word was barely audible over the hiss of the rain, but it hit me harder than a flashbang. The socialites behind him leaned in, confused by the sudden change in tone. The Admiral didn't care about them anymore. He took a step closer, his expensive shoes splashing through the puddle I'd been sitting in all afternoon. He saw the small, silver trident pin I had tucked into the lining of my jacket, the only thing I hadn't sold for a meal. He realized he was looking at the man who had pulled his son's entire platoon out of a burning valley in Tora Bora while the rest of the world was sleeping. The silence on that sidewalk became a vacuum. The security guards retreated, sensing a shift in the hierarchy that they weren't cleared to understand. The Admiral reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he touched the shoulder of my damp jacket. He wasn't looking at a homeless man anymore. He was looking at a legend who had been left to rot in the shadows of the very city he'd protected. He saw the scars on my neck where a piece of RPG casing had tried to take my head off. And he saw the hollowed-out cheeks of a man who hadn't eaten a hot meal in 3 days. "My God, Miller," he said, his voice cracking with a raw, unscripted emotion that made the handler flinch. "What happened to you? We thought you were—" He couldn't even finish the sentence. He looked at the hotel,
the lights, the champagne glasses visible through the lobby windows, and then back at the cardboard I'd been calling home. The shame on his face was so thick you could smell it. He realized that while he was inside being toasted as a hero, the man who had actually done the work was outside, being threatened with pepper spray by a guy who couldn't even handle a dog.
I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. The canine did all the talking for me. The dog leaned his heavy head against my thigh, his tail giving one more authoritative thump against the concrete. He was telling the Admiral that the rank didn't matter, the clothes didn't matter, and the money didn't matter. In the world of the elite, there is only the bond, and that bond had just saved my life. The Admiral straightened his back, his face hardening into the mask of a commander who had just found a missing soldier on the battlefield. He turned to the handler, his voice dropping into a low, lethal growl that made the younger man snap to attention. "Take the dog to the vehicle," the Admiral ordered. "And if I ever see you jerk that lead on a Tier 1 asset again, you'll be walking a beat in the Arctic." He then turned to the security guards, his gaze cold enough to freeze the rain in midair. "This man is a guest of the United States Navy. If any of you so much as breathe in his direction for the rest of the night, you'll be answering to me personally." The socialites were stunned. They watched as the man they had stepped over for weeks was suddenly draped in the aura of a high-ranking official's protection. The Admiral didn't wait for a response. He looked at me, his eyes searching for the man who used to lead the teams. "Chief Miller," he said, his voice firm now, the voice of a man issuing a mission order that couldn't be refused. "The gala is over. We're leaving. You're coming with me, and we are going to fix this. That is a direct order. Do you understand?" I looked at him, then at the canine watching me from the SUV window, and finally at the cardboard box that had been my only friend for months. I felt the old iron in my soul finally lock into place. The invisibility was gone. The ghost was dead. I nodded once, a sharp military movement that felt like coming home. As I stepped toward the armored vehicle, leaving the rainy sidewalk behind, I realized that the dog hadn't just bowed to me. He had called me back to the world of the living. The war wasn't over, but for the first time in years, I wasn't fighting it alone. The Admiral didn't wait for a response, and he didn't care about the confused whispers of the crowd that was now staring at us like we were a glitch in their expensive reality. He reached out and gripped my forearm, his hand squeezing the tattered sleeve of my field jacket with a strength that spoke of old bonds and unspoken apologies. He turned to the security guards, who were still standing there with their radios half raised, looking like they had just seen a statue come to life. His voice didn't just carry, it commanded the very air on that street corner. "This man," the Admiral said, his gaze leveling the lead guard like a sniper scope, "has done more for this country while bleeding out in a ditch than all of you will do in 3 lifetimes. If I hear so much as a whisper of disrespect toward him, I will make it my personal mission to ensure you never work security in this zip code again. Do I make myself clear?" The guard didn't even nod. He just backed away, his face turning a pale shade of gray as he realized he had almost pepper-sprayed a living legend. The Admiral didn't look back at the hotel or the gala he was supposed to be hosting. He guided me toward the open door of the armored SUV, his hand never leaving my shoulder, as if he was afraid I might vanish back into the shadows if he let go. I felt the heat radiating from the interior of the vehicle, a luxurious warmth that felt alien against my damp, chilled skin. As I climbed into the leather seat, the smell of expensive upholstery and high-grade electronics filled my nose, a sharp contrast to the damp cardboard and diesel fumes I had been living in for months. The canine was already inside, sitting perfectly still in the rear compartment. The moment I sat down, the Belgian Malinois broke his stay and lunged forward, not with aggression, but with a desperate, whining need for contact. He rested his heavy, velvet-furred head on my knee, his tail thumping rhythmically against the floorboards. I reached out, my hands still shaking from the cold and the sheer shock of the moment, and buried my fingers in the thick fur behind his ears.
He let out a low, contented huff, his eyes closing as he leaned his entire weight against me. In that moment, the armor I had built around my heart for 3 years finally cracked. The Admiral climbed in beside me and signaled the driver. "Move out," he said shortly. "Take us to the residence, and call ahead. Tell them we have a guest who needs everything: food, clothes, a medic, and a secure line." He then turned to me, his expression softening into something that looked a lot like grief. He looked at the way I was huddled in the seat, my fingers still locked in the dog's fur, and he shook his head slowly. "Miller, I have no excuses for how the system failed you. We thought you were off the grid by choice. We thought you wanted to be left alone." I looked out the tinted window as the Plaza Hotel faded into the rain. I saw the spot on the sidewalk where I had been sitting 10 minutes ago, a discarded pile of rags and a piece of paper that meant nothing to anyone. I realized that to the world out there, I was still just a ghost. But inside this vehicle, I was a chief again. "I didn't want to be alone, Admiral," I said, my voice sounding raw and foreign to my own ears. "I just didn't know how to be anything else. When the missions stop and the dog is gone, the silence gets pretty loud." The drive was silent for a long time, the only sound being the hiss of tires on the wet pavement and the steady breathing of the canine. The Admiral watched me, his mind clearly working through 1,000 logistics to fix the wreckage of my civilian life. He saw the scars on my wrists from the zip ties of a 3-day interrogation in a basement in Yemen, and he saw the way I kept checking the mirrors, a habit that never truly leaves an operator. He knew that fixing my bank account was the easy part. Fixing the man would take a lot longer. The tables had turned so fast I felt dizzy. An hour ago, I was worried about where to find a dry spot to sleep. Now I was being escorted by a 4-star admiral to a secure residence. The socialites back at the gala would be talking about the homeless hero for weeks, turning my trauma into a dinner party anecdote, but they wouldn't understand the reality of the bond that had just saved me. They saw a dog bowing to a beggar. I saw a brother-in-arms calling in a medevac for a fallen comrade. We pulled into a private drive, the gates swinging open with a silent, heavy precision. The Admiral looked at me and reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, burnished coin, his personal commander's coin. He pressed it into my hand, his fingers closing mine around the cold metal. "The canine knew Miller," he whispered. "Even when I didn't recognize my own best handler, that animal knew the caliber of the man sitting in the dirt. He didn't bow out of pity, he bowed out of recognition." As the vehicle came to a halt in front of a sprawling, secure estate, I looked down at the dog. He was looking back at me with those golden, intelligent eyes, his ears pricked for the next command. I realized that my life as a ghost was officially over. I wasn't going back to that sidewalk, and I wasn't going back to being invisible. The war had followed me home, but for the first time in a very long time, I had a pack again. The Admiral opened the door, the light from the house spilling out across the lawn, and I stepped out of the shadows and into the light, finally ready to come home from a war that had lasted far too long. The transition from the sidewalk to the Admiral's study felt like a deep-sea diver surfacing too fast. The pressure change was enough to make my head spin. I sat in a chair that cost more than my last 3 years of existence, my tattered jacket looking like a wound against the cream-colored upholstery. The Admiral didn't offer me a drink or a lecture. He just sat across from me, watching as the Malinois, whose name I now knew was Bear, refused to leave my side. Bear had parked his 60-pound frame across my boots, a physical anchor keeping me tethered to the present moment. It was a silent statement of protection that spoke volumes more than the medals hanging on the walls of this room. The Admiral leaned forward, his hands clasped, his eyes searching mine for the man he used to command. "I've spent the last hour on the phone, Guller," he said, his voice dropping into that low, gravelly tone of a commander who had already secured the objective. Your record was flagged, filed, and then buried under a mountain of bureaucratic static. The VA thought you were deceased, and the Navy thought you were in deep cover private contracting. Nobody looked because they assumed a man of your caliber couldn't possibly fall through the cracks. He paused, the shame from the sidewalk still lingering in the corners of his mouth. We were wrong. I was wrong. I looked down at the silver coin in my palm, the ridges digging into my skin. It was a physical reminder that I was back in the fold, but the weight of the last 3 years didn't just vanish because a high-ranking officer said sorry. I thought about the cold nights, the hunger that felt like a living thing inside my ribs, and the way people would pull their children closer when they walked past me. I thought about how a dog had to show the world my value because the humans had forgotten how to look. "The cracks are wider than you think, Admiral," I said, my voice finally finding its steady, operational clip. "I'm just the one who got sniffed out." He nodded slowly, acknowledging the hit. "Tomorrow, we start the paperwork to reinstate your benefits, backdated to the day you touched down in Norfolk. But that's just logistics. What I really need is a lead instructor for the new K9 Tier 1 program at Dam Neck. The handlers are green, the dogs are elite, and they need someone who speaks the language." He looked at Bear, who let out a soft, huffing breath. "Clearly, you still have the touch. The system might have forgotten you, but the Brotherhood hasn't. You aren't a ghost anymore, Chief. You're an asset." I looked at the window, seeing my reflection in the glass, a man who looked like he had been through a war, because I had. I saw the grime and the beard, but behind it, I saw the operator again. I realized that the Admiral wasn't just offering me a job, he was offering me a purpose, a reason to wake up that didn't involve finding a dry piece of cardboard. He was offering me a way to turn the pain of the last 3 years into a shield for the next generation of teams. I looked back at Bear, and for the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel the urge to disappear into the shadows. The socialites at the gala would probably never know the full story, and that was fine by me. They could keep their champagne and their polished floors. I had something better. I had the respect of a creature that didn't care about politics or optics. I had the bow of a warrior. As I stood up, my joints finally warming up in the heat of the house, I felt the phantom weight of my gear returning to my shoulders. It wasn't the weight of a burden anymore. It was the weight of responsibility. I was ready to stop running from the silence. The Admiral stood with me, offering a hand that I took with a firm, decisive grip. "Welcome back to the world, Miller," he said, and for the first time, he smiled. A small, knowing look between two men who had seen the worst the world had to offer. We walked toward the door, Bear staying perfectly at my heel, his ears pricked for the next move. I knew the road back wouldn't be easy, and the nightmares wouldn't just stop because I had a paycheck, but I wasn't walking that road alone anymore. I had a pack, I had a mission, and I had a dog who reminded me that honor never truly fades. So, next time you're walking down a city street and you see a guy in a faded camo jacket looking like he's lost his way, take a second look. Don't just see the dirt or the rags. Look at the eyes. You might be looking at a story you aren't cleared to hear, or a hero who's just waiting for a sign to come back from the dead. Respect isn't something you buy at a gala. It's something earned in the trenches, and once you've earned it, it stays with you forever. Till next time, stay sharp, stay frosty, and never leave a brother behind. This is Chief Miller, signing off.